Glad you're back. You know, there's a miracle of friendship that dwells within the heart, and you don't know how it happens or how it got its start. But the happiness it brings you gives a special lift, and you realize that friendship is God's most precious gift. And I believe that. I had a client who owed me a good deal of money. Eventually, she stopped seeing me. But each month, I would send her a bill and receive no response. Finally, I wrote to her and said, I don't know what difficulty has befallen you that you've been unable to pay me. But whatever it is, I'm writing to tell you that your debt is forgiven in full. My only request is that at some point in your life, when your circumstances have changed, you will pass this favor on to someone else. And that's a pretty good remedy. I recommend it. Checked your oil lately? I grew suspicious when the check gauges light kept flashing at me from the dashboard of my 1991 Chevy Blazer. In the 6 years I had owned this car, I couldn't remember ever seeing the light come on before. So I did what every red-blooded American male does in such circumstances. I ignored it. You see, my Blazer is a little quirky. For years I entertained my friends by activating my windshield wipers with the turn signal, or by inserting a cassette into the deck that was somehow locked into the on position. When my friends pound each other on their backs and howl with laughter at my windshield wipers signal a left turn, I feel good that my car can provide amusement as well as transportation. Mr. Blazer is also not to be trusted. I've run out of gas multiple times with the gauge reading 1/4 full. Unlike the turn signal trick, this quirk gets on my nerves. The car lies to me, so when it started telling me to check its gauges, I laughed. Ha! Not going to sucker me this time. I kept on driving until I noticed that whenever I came to a full stop, the oil gauge would plummet to 0. That's funny, I thought. I wonder if my oil is low. I quickly dismissed that idea, despite the fact that I couldn't actually remember the last time I put oil in the car. I often accused my daughter Candace of expecting the oil and coolant fairies to magically keep her machine lubed and watered. I, however, am much too experienced and mature to believe such things about my own car. I'm just too busy for such mundane things, and will get around to them eventually. That's what happened to our hot water heater last week. My husband thought it needed replacing, but he just didn't get around to it fast enough. This story tells a story on him. That's why we had a flooded lower level. After a few days with the light flashing and the oil gauge plummeting to 0 every time I braked, I decided to check it when I filled my gas tank. I lifted the hood, and after reorienting myself to where these things were, I didn't go there very often, I found the dipstick and attempted to pull on it. I said attempted because I couldn't get the oily thing to budge. I yanked and grunted and looked around to make sure no one was watching. Finally, in disgust, I gave up and decided I'd wait until I was out of public eye before trying again. When I did get home that evening, I grabbed a pair of pliers and attacked the dipstick for all I was worth. With a mighty final tug and pull, it gave way. After collecting myself from the garage floor, I saw what the problem was. It had rusted shut. Apparently, it had been so long since I had last checked my oil that the dipstick had actually rusted shut. You already know how much oil registered on the dipstick, don't you? I inserted and reinserted that stick into the crankcase several times, and the only thing clinging to it was rust particles from the oxidized chamber. I quickly chugged 2 quarts of oil down my thirsty car's throat. Excuse me. And finally got a reading on the dipstick. After adding a 3rd quart the next day, I realized that in addition to providing rides and occasional laughs, my blazer can also teach spiritual object lessons. In the Bible, oil is often used as a symbol for the Holy Spirit. In Jesus' story about the 10 virgins, 5 were declared wise for having brought along extra oil. The other 5 did not have enough oil reserves to lamp their lamps when the bridegroom arrived late. They are labeled foolish. If they had all been driving Chevy Blazers, the wise would have thrown a couple of extra quarts of Pennzoil in the trunk, just in case of an emergency. I guess we all know which group I would have belonged to. There was nothing noticeably different about these women. They all were lovely bridesmaids. They all wore lovely bridesmaids' gowns. They all carried the same lamps, were going to the same party, and had the same invitation. When the bridegroom was delayed, they all got sleepy and napped. When the bridegroom finally arrived and the drowsy attendants scrambled to their feet, there was an immediate and distinct difference between them. The difference was oil. The Holy Spirit was more abundant and more assimilated into the lives of the wise than those of the foolish. 2 Corinthians 13:5 encourages us to examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Paul is saying, check your spiritual gauge. Take inventory. Run a check disk on the hard drive of your heart every now and then to see if all is well. Why? Because in the noise, hurry, and clatter of modern life, it's way too easy to ignore the gentle voice of Jesus and neglect his Spirit's work in our lives. We may be rusting spiritually and running on empty without even knowing it. What are some of the symptoms of low oil in a believer's life? Rough idle. Upon reflection, I did recall hearing a louder than usual rattle on my car idled in the driveway, as my car idled in the driveway. When we allow the oil of the Holy Spirit to get too low in our lives, we often develop some roughness in our temperaments and rattle about with criticism and complaining. I remember visiting a church that was having its first baptism in several years. It was high day, and the church was filled with visitors and well-wishers. The baptism and subsequent laying on of hands extended the service past its usual noon dismissal time by about 30 minutes. As the congregation was filing out and shaking hands with the pastor, one agitated member laid into the minister for letting church out 30 minutes late. As the congregation was filing out and shaking hands with the pastor, okay, I already read that. Sorry about that. If that man was a reflection of the entire congregation, was it any wonder that the baptistry was filled more with cobwebs than with water? That man was low on oil, and a critical spirit had replaced the gracefulness of the Holy Spirit in his life. Poor performance. An engine low on oil doesn't perform efficiently. Gas mileage is poor, interior parts wear out faster, and the engine runs hotter. Likewise, a Christian low on the Holy Spirit is unable to give his or her best to Christ in service. Patience wears out faster. Such a person frequently gets hot under the collar and lets off steam in the direction of unsuspecting family or church members. And because they work or serve in their own strength, they burn out and shut down. I was visiting speaker at a large church one Sabbath when a church member, the pastor's wife, stormed out of the service because someone had occupied her seat. Never mind that the dastardly pew thief was a first-time visitor to the church and didn't know that, at least at that row, there was assigned seating. Low oil. A bad smell. My wife, Suzette, has a keen sense of smell, and not unlike a polar bear that can sniff out a seal hiding under their 3 feet of ice. She always complains that my car smells like something is burning. I never smell anything until flames come leaping out of the exhaust. The point is, if something smells bad, it's time to check the oil. The prayers of God's people ascend to him as sweet incense. They are sweet aromas in his nostrils. When Christians get low on the Holy Spirit, we cease to pray. TV, sports, web surfing, earning money, or even sleeping consumes our time, and soon we stop coming into God's presence. If our prayers smell like incense to God, what does prayerlessness smell like? The stench of soul decay, the rancid whiff of spiritual dryness. Christians who keep on being filled with the Holy Spirit oil, as the literal interpretation of Ephesians 5:18 reads, are filled with the graces of love, joy, peace, long-suffering, meekness, self-control that reveal to others we've been with Jesus. Prayerlessness, burnout, spiritual dryness, lack of patience, a critical, complaining spirit. These are all indicators of a Holy Spirit oil shortage in our lives. Fortunately, our Father in heaven is more willing to give us of his Holy Spirit than we are to give good gifts to our children. Once we stop ignoring the warning gauges, all we have to do is ask, and he will fill our need with all the fullness of his divine presence. My blazer is running fine now. It smells better too. Suzette still insists I should take it in for a tune-up. I think I'll listen this time. Winter is coming, and the old girl, my car, not my wife, needs to be ready. The bridegroom is coming too. Have you checked your oil lately? This article is by Randy Maxwell. I love his writings. Is an author and speaker who writes from Napa, Idaho. I tell you, he's a great man. I read one of his books recently, or not so recently. Anyway, God bless you.